If you ever wondered what happened to ISIS, John Irvine has the story tonight of the terror organisation's last stand.
Islamic State shell a strategic building held by the Kurds, who soon find themselves surrounded and respond.
John saw women and children slipping out of this, the last ISIS stronghold in Syria. He also witnessed the terrible price the Kurds have paid for their part in winning this war, and they are, of course, soon to be abandoned to their fate by their American allies. It is a fascinating piece of frontline journalism. I'll also be talking to Raghi here about where all those members of ISIS have dispersed to. Good evening. For the past 4 years, so-called Islamic State has cast a very long shadow across the Middle East and indeed the world, claiming hundreds of lives in pursuit of a twisted ideology. For a while, it was not just a terror organisation, but a geographical Islamic State of sorts, spread over parts of Syria and Iraq. Now, the last remaining IS stronghold in Syria is about to fall. At one point, the caliphate stretched right across Syria and into neighbouring Iraq, covering an area the size of Britain and 8 million people. But under relentless pressure from the air and the ground, the group has been forced back into just a handful of small pockets of resistance. One of those is the town of Al-Susa, where John Irvine, cameraman Sean Swan and producer Lutfi Abouan saw Kurdish forces closing in.
Mentioned in the book of Genesis as a river of Eden, today the Euphrates is part of an ending as well as a beginning, for it's on the banks of this storied waterway that the Islamic State is meeting its end. Pummeled by modern weaponry, the cruel caliphate, once the size of Britain, has been reduced to a single riverside village in the distance here. It is now surrounded by these troops, the Syrian Kurds. Brave but light on equipment, our Kurdish allies, women fighters as well as men, rely on friends in high places, with American air power in particular crucial to the winning of this long war. Drones help identify targets for one of the US Air Force's most advanced bombers. Rarely seen in action, it drops massive ordnance. On the battlefield itself, these are American soldiers. They're a mortar team. With President Trump talking about imminent withdrawal, the sense here is that the Pentagon wants this finished soon. The operation to rid the world of the monstrous caliphate here in Syria began 4 long years ago. Since then, the Kurdish forces, backed up by coalition air power and artillery, have pushed the Islamic State back more than 250 miles from the Turkish border to this point and the final battle. Islamic State shell a strategic building held by the Kurds, who soon find themselves surrounded and respond. The IS fighters get closer in an armoured car, but eventually their assault is repelled, and as they try to make a getaway, the armoured car is targeted by a coalition warplane. This Kurdish commander told me that the end is now in sight. He said they had the last IS fighters trapped and had informed them there's no prospect of escape. Every day some civilians do manage to get out of the besieged pocket. They're met in the desert and taken to refugee camps. They are women, children and the elderly. There are no men of fighting age among them. Why they fled the war is obvious given the level of destruction wrought here. And those who have started to return to villages liberated months ago find much of home now lies in ruins. The defeat of IS has come at a high price indeed. 19-year-old Abdul Karim lost many family members during the war. He said he had joined up not just to get revenge for his relatives, but for all those round the world who are grieving because of IS. The Kurds are fully aware of the attacks in places like Manchester, Paris and Nice, but it is they who've borne the brunt. This funeral brought the number of Kurdish fighters killed by IS and buried in this one cemetery to well over 700, and there are a dozen graveyards like this. They had hoped that the world would be grateful and indebted to them for being the boots on the ground that wiped out the Islamic State, but instead they feel let down and vulnerable. As they continue to bury and mourn those killed winning this war, the Kurds fear that without the Americans here to shield them, another war will soon come along. John Irvine, News at 10, Eastern Syria.
Well, as John mentioned there, IS might have been largely defeated in Syria, but it is far from finished. The group's ideology is still inspiring organisations in countries as far apart as Libya, and part, of course, fueled by the civil war there, Afghanistan, where it has grown out of the ashes of Al-Qaeda, the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, and Nigeria, of course, where Boko Haram has taken up the fight in its name. And Raghi is, of course, here to discuss all of this. I mean, listen, this is not the end of IS, in short, is it?
No, very far from it. I mean, they came as a classic insurgency come terrorist organisation. As you said, they built up their so-called sort of caliphate off the ashes of a very sectarian, divided Iraq and a dictatorship in Syria in the form of Assad that was at war with its own people. They will go back to where they came from, which is as an insurgency, sort of guerrilla movement with hit-and-run tactics. They may have lost their territory and squeezed out, as John was saying, in their last enclave in Syria, but that does not mean that their ideology and the appeal to people, because they do have an appeal. It's hard to sort of imagine, but there are people in Iraq and Syria who feel that, you know, they have cause with them. As far as we're concerned here in the West, they will continue to still inspire sort of individual jihadists. Even this last week, whilst John was sort of reporting for that part of Syria, an American member of ISIS was picked up, a Canadian member of ISIS was picked up. They still have an appeal for Westerners.
OK, Raghi, thank you very much.